The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and already open when I saw it on my parents' mantel. My name was typed across the front in black ink. Not handwritten, typed. That was the first thing that told me this wasn't a birthday card or a thank you note. This was a document. I'm Claire Holloway. I'm 32 years old. And the night before my younger brother's wedding, I realized my family had already decided where I no longer belonged. I had driven 6 hours from Raleigh to my parents' house outside Charlottesville, Virginia. It was late October, the kind of evening where the air smells like damp leaves and chimney smoke. I arrived after dark, tired, stiff-backed, still wearing my blazer from work because I hadn't even stopped to change. My promotion hearing with the hospital board had run long. I'm an operations director for a regional healthcare system. It's not glamorous, but it's precise. I like systems. I like accountability. I like knowing where things stand. When I walked into the house, my mother didn't look up from the kitchen island. "You're late," she said. Not as an observation, but a judgment. "I drove straight from work," I replied, setting my overnight bag by the stairs. My father, Harold, was in his armchair with the TV muted, pretending to read. He nodded once, the way men do when they don't want to be involved. My brother, Evan, wasn't there. He was at the rehearsal dinner with his fiancé's family. I hadn't been invited. Just immediate family, my mother had explained. Apparently, I didn't qualify. I told myself it didn't matter. I was here for the wedding. I was here because that's what you do. You show up, you smile, you keep the peace. Then I saw the envelope. It was propped carefully against a framed photo of Evan and his fiancée, Lila, taken on a beach somewhere expensive. The return address belonged to Whitmore and Keene, attorneys at law. I recognized the name instantly. They'd handled my grandmother's estate 3 years earlier. My stomach tightened, slow and cold. I picked up the envelope before I could stop myself. My mother turned sharply. "That's not for you. It has my name on it," I said. She walked over and took the envelope from my hand with a quick, efficient motion, like a nurse confiscating a phone in an ICU. "It's just paperwork. You don't need to concern yourself." Concern. That word again. The family favorite. It meant stay in your lane. It meant don't ask questions. It meant accept what you're given. I nodded and stepped back. I didn't argue. I hadn't argued in years. Later that night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its unchanged floral curtains and twin bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about all the times I'd been told not to concern myself. When my birthday was forgotten 3 years in a row. When my parents couldn't make it to my doctoral graduation, but flew to Aspen for Evan's engagement trip. When my mother told people I preferred to be independent, as if that independence hadn't been forced on me early and often. Around midnight, I heard voices downstairs. Low, tense. I recognized my mother's tone, controlled. My father's quieter, defensive. And a third voice, Evan's. I got out of bed and stood at the top of the stairs, just close enough to hear. "We can't do this tomorrow," Evan was saying. "Not at the wedding." "She doesn't need to know now," my mother replied. "It's already finalized." My father cleared his throat. "Maybe we should have told her sooner." There was a pause. Then Evan laughed, short and humorless. "Told her what? That she's been living off assumptions for a decade? That she thought she was part of something she wasn't?" My fingers curled around the banister. "She's not stupid," my father said, weakly. "No," my mother said, "but she's compliant. She always has been." That word landed harder than anything else I'd heard. Compliant. I went back to bed and didn't sleep. The next morning, the house buzzed with wedding chaos. Hair appointments, garment bags, phone calls, coffee going cold on the counter. I stayed out of the way, as usual. I helped when asked. I folded programs. I held doors. I smiled for photos I wouldn't be in. Around 10, my mother handed me a garment bag. "Take this to the venue," she said. "Put it in the bride's suite." I nodded and took my keys. As I passed the mantel, the envelope was gone. At the venue, a restored plantation-style estate that now called itself a boutique wedding destination. I delivered the garment bag and stood awkwardly while Lila's bridesmaids laughed and drank mimosas. No one asked me to stay. I walked back to my car and sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, watching people I didn't know move confidently, through a space I was supposed to belong to. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Check your email. It's time you read it yourself. No signature. No explanation. I opened my inbox. The subject line read, Amendment to Trust and Property Allocation. The sender, Whitmore and Keene. My breath slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. The way it does when something you've half expected finally arrives. I opened the email. Attached was a scanned copy of a document dated 6 weeks earlier. It detailed revisions to the Holloway Family Trust, originally established by my grandfather. I skimmed it first, then read more carefully, line by line, the way I read contracts at work. My name appeared exactly once, removed as beneficiary. In its place, Evan Holloway, sole heir to the residential property, investment accounts, and controlling interest in Holloway Agricultural Holdings, the family business that had quietly expanded over 40 years. I sat in the car with the engine off, the noise of the wedding distant and muffled, and felt something shift inside me. Not shock, not grief, clarity. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't emotional. This was planned, reviewed, signed, witnessed, filed, and no one had intended to tell me. At the bottom of the email was a forwarded note, clearly not meant for me. She won't contest. She never does. It was my mother's email address. I closed my phone and stared out the windshield. For years, I'd told myself that love in my family was just quiet, that support came in indirect ways, that exclusion wasn't intentional. I was wrong. This wasn't neglect. This was strategy. Behind me, church bells began to ring. The wedding was starting. I sat there, breathing evenly, feeling the weight of something I hadn't yet named, but already understood. I wasn't losing my place. It had been taken. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself or ask why. I felt the urge to act. I didn't go into the ceremony right away. I stayed in the car until the bells stopped ringing, until the murmur of guests settled into that soft, reverent hush weddings always carry. I watched people file past the windows, in tailored suits and dresses chosen weeks in advance, people who assumed they understood what this day meant. Celebration, union, family. I opened the document again, this time not skimming, not reacting, but reading the way I read budget proposals and compliance reports, slowly, methodically. No emotion, just facts. The trust amendment wasn't sloppy. It was clean, thorough, crafted by someone who expected scrutiny. Dates aligned, signatures notarized, language airtight. My grandfather's original intent was referenced and then carefully reinterpreted. Evan was described as the child most actively involved in preserving family legacy. I almost smiled at that. Evan had never worked a day in the family business. He'd never even visited the processing facility in Shenandoah County. But language, when written by lawyers, doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be defensible. I noticed something else. A clause added at the end. Any prior informal contributions, gifts, or educational assistance provided to Claire Holloway shall be considered an advance on inheritance already received. That stopped me. I thought back. There had been no contributions, no gifts, no assistance. I'd paid for my master's degree with loans and night shifts. I'd paid my rent since I was 22. The only thing my parents had ever given me financially was a used car with a cracked dashboard when I graduated college. I'd sold it 2 years later to cover a medical bill. Advance on inheritance. That was a lie designed to look reasonable to outsiders. A paper trail invented after the fact. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the memory roll back. Thanksgiving dinners, where Evan's internship offers were discussed like national news, while my promotion announcements earned nods and a quick change of subject. Christmas mornings, where my gifts were thoughtful but small, practical, always framed as encouragement to be self-sufficient. The way my mother would say it with pride, as if she'd trained me that way intentionally, rather than simply withholding. I had mistaken absence for neutrality. I'd assumed silence meant indifference. It didn't. It meant decision. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Evan. "Where are you?" Mom's asking. I typed back, "Needed air. I'll be there." I didn't add an apology. I didn't explain. That was new. When I finally walked into the ceremony space, the vows were already underway. I slipped into a seat in the back row, alone. No one turned around. No one noticed. That, too, was familiar. As Evan spoke about commitment and honesty, I watched my mother dab at her eyes. My father stood stiffly beside her, jaw set. I wondered if he'd argued about the trust amendment. I wondered if he'd signed it anyway. I suspected the answer was yes. The applause at the end felt distant, like it was happening in another room. I clapped because that's what people do. I smiled when Evan kissed Lila. I told myself this wasn't the moment. This wasn't the place. The reception was worse. Assigned seating put me at a table with Lila's coworkers, people who asked polite questions and forgot my name within minutes. Evan's speech thanked our parents for everything they've done for me. He didn't mention me, not even as an afterthought. My mother hugged me near the bar. "We'll talk later," she said softly, her hand tight on my arm. It wasn't a promise. It was a warning. I nodded. Later came after the cake, after the dancing, after most of the guests had thinned out. I found my parents in a side room near the kitchen, where staff were stacking plates and the illusion of elegance was already collapsing. My mother closed the door behind me. "You shouldn't have opened that email," she said. "I was supposed to never know," I asked. "It wasn't meant to upset you," she replied, which was not an answer. I looked at my father. "Did you know?" He hesitated, just long enough to tell me everything. "Your mother handled the details," he said. Handled. Another favorite word. I took a breath. I kept my voice even. "You removed me from the trust." My mother crossed her arms. "We adjusted things to reflect reality." "What reality?" "That Evan is more involved, more invested." "In what?" I asked. "I live 3 hours away because you encouraged me to take the job. You said it was smart." She waved that off. "You've always been capable. You land on your feet." There it was. The compliment that functioned as justification. Because I was capable, I was expendable. "I wasn't informed," I said. "No," she agreed, "because you would have made this difficult." My father finally looked at me. His eyes were tired. "Claire, it's not personal." I nodded once. "Then it's structural." They didn't understand what I meant. That was fine. I did. I left shortly after. No dramatic exit, no raised voices. I hugged Evan goodbye. He smelled like champagne and relief. "Love you," he said, automatically. "I know," I replied. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I did. The drive back to Raleigh was quiet. No music, no calls, just headlights and time. Around midnight, I stopped at a rest area and pulled up the trust document again. This time, I wasn't reading it as a daughter. I was reading it as an administrator. I noticed inconsistencies, small ones. A valuation date that didn't align with the last appraisal. A reference to agricultural holdings that conflicted with public filings I'd seen years earlier when I helped Evan prepare a college paper. I remembered thinking then that the numbers didn't add up. At the time, I'd assumed I was missing context. Now, I suspected I'd been excluded from it. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat and logged into the state's public business registry. Holloway Agricultural Holdings had filed an amendment 6 months ago. A change in officers. My mother listed as managing member. That was new. So was the line below it. Pending lien. I sat there under fluorescent lights, the hum of vending machines in the distance, and felt the shift solidify. This wasn't just about inheritance. This was about control. About shielding assets. About positioning Evan as the face while someone else pulled the strings. And for reasons that had nothing to do with fairness, I'd been removed from the equation. I closed the laptop and stared at my reflection in the dark windshield. 32 years old, stable career, clean credit, no scandals, no leverage over me. That was the problem. I didn't storm back. I didn't call a lawyer that night. I didn't send angry messages or demand explanations. I went home. I slept. I went to work on Monday and ran meetings and approved budgets and solved problems that weren't mine. But something had changed. I stopped thinking like a daughter. I started thinking like someone who had been deliberately excluded from a system she helped normalize. And systems, once exposed, can be corrected. The first thing I did was nothing. That sounds passive, but it wasn't. It was strategic. Silence, when used deliberately, buys you time. Time to observe, time to gather, time to let other people assume you've accepted the version of reality they handed you. For 3 weeks after the wedding, I didn't bring up the trust. I didn't ask questions. I didn't confront my parents again. I sent the expected thank you text for the hotel room they'd booked me, even though I hadn't asked for it. I replied to my mother's occasional messages with neutral politeness. Short sentences, no emotion. She relaxed almost immediately. That told me more than any confession could have. At work, I did the opposite. I leaned in. I asked questions I'd been putting off. I requested access to data sets that had previously lived one level above my role. No one objected. I had a reputation for discretion, for being unproblematic. That reputation had been earned in my family long before I ever entered the workforce. One afternoon, during a quarterly operations review, our general counsel mentioned a case involving family-owned businesses and internal misrepresentation. I listened carefully. After the meeting, I followed her back to her office. Hypothetically, I said, leaning against the doorframe, if a managing member of an LLC misstates asset values in estate planning documents, what usually triggers discovery? She studied me for a moment. Hypothetically, she said, it's often a lien, a tax discrepancy, or a disgruntled beneficiary, even if that beneficiary was removed. She smiled slightly. Especially then. I thanked her and left. That night, I pulled everything I could find on Holloway Agricultural Holdings. Public filings, old tax summaries, local news articles about land acquisitions. I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for patterns. The company had expanded quietly over the last decade, acquiring parcels of farmland that had later been rezoned for mixed commercial use. Warehouses, solar leases, distribution contracts. Nothing flashy, but steady, profitable. Yet the trust amendment valued the business at nearly 40% less than its last publicly recorded estimate. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. I also noticed something else. A loan taken out 18 months earlier using one of the original parcels as collateral. The lender was a private equity group based in Maryland. The repayment schedule was aggressive. Too aggressive for a business supposedly worth less than before. I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. You don't undervalue an asset unless you're trying to move something quietly or hide it. Around the same time, my father called. That was unusual. He didn't call unless something was wrong with the car or the roof. Your mother's been stressed, he said after a few minutes of small talk. This wedding took a lot out of her. I'm sure, I replied. She feels bad about how things went, he continued. I waited. Silence again. He filled it. She just didn't want you hurt. I closed my eyes briefly. By not telling me? Yes, there it was. The logic loop. Protect by excluding. Love by controlling. Dad? I said calmly. Did you read the amendment before you signed it? Another pause. Longer this time. Your mother said it was standard. Did you read it? No, he admitted. I thanked him for his honesty and changed the subject. He seemed relieved. 2 days later, I received an email from Whitmore and Keene, a form letter, cordial in tone, informing me that all estate matters had been finalized and that no further action was required on my part. No further action required. That phrase assumes compliance. I forwarded the email to my personal folder labeled Work Samples. Then I added a note beneath it. Date received. No acknowledgement of beneficiary removal discussion. Documentation matters. At the end of that week, my mother invited me to dinner. Just the three of us. Neutral territory. A restaurant halfway between Raleigh and Charlottesville. She even used the word reset. I agreed. She chose a place with linen tablecloths and soft lighting, the kind of restaurant that signals civility. She arrived early. So did I. My father came last, already apologetic in his posture. We ordered wine. I declined. I'm glad we're doing this, my mother said, folding her napkin with care. I hate tension. I know, I replied. She smiled, as if that settled something. Halfway through the meal, she brought it up herself. I hope you understand why we made the choices we did. I met her gaze. I understand why you made them. I don't agree with them. She nodded, lips tight. Evan needs stability. You've always been adaptable. There it is again, I said softly. Adaptable. My father shifted in his seat. I want you to hear this clearly, I continued. I'm not asking to be added back. I'm not contesting anything. My mother's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. But, I said, I am asking for transparency. Her eyes sharpened. About what? About the business? About the valuation? About the loan you took out last year? My father looked at her. What loan? She shot me a look, sharp, calculating. That's not your concern, she said. I smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, just precisely. It became my concern when my name was removed to make it easier. She leaned back. You're imagining things. I don't imagine numbers, I replied. The rest of the dinner passed in strained politeness. When we stood to leave, she kissed my cheek a little too hard. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar email address. Subject: You don't know me, but you should. The body was brief. My name is Samuel Reed. I used to work for Holloway Agricultural Holdings. I left last year. There are things you should know before they get worse. He included a phone number. I didn't call him that night. I saved the contact. I added it to my growing file. Silence had bought me something valuable. People assumed I wouldn't act. They were wrong. I waited 4 days before calling Samuel Reed. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be deliberate. People who reach out like that are either desperate or careful. The timing of your response tells them which kind of power you think you have. I wanted him to believe I had patience. I called on a Wednesday evening, after dinner, when my apartment was quiet and my notes were laid out on the table in front of me. He picked up on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. His voice was calm, older than I expected. Not nervous, not rushed. You said there are things I should know, I replied. Start wherever makes sense. He exhaled slowly. I worked operations for Holloway Agricultural Holdings for 11 years. I reported directly to your mother for the last 3. That tracked. My grandfather had run the business with a small, loyal staff. After his stroke, my mother had stepped in temporarily. Temporary had a way of becoming permanent in our family. She didn't like questions, Samuel continued, especially from people who remembered how things used to be. Meaning the books used to be clean. Conservative, but clean. After she took over, things got creative. I didn't interrupt. Silence again. People fill it with more than they intend. She started moving assets between entities, leasing land to shell LLCs she controlled, taking out loans against properties while undervaluing them in internal reports. When I raised concerns, she said I didn't understand the bigger picture. Did you? I asked. He laughed softly. I understood enough to know I didn't want my name on the next audit. That word hung between us. Audit. I left after she asked me to sign off on a valuation I knew was wrong, he said. She offered me a severance package if I kept quiet. Did you take it? Yes, he said without hesitation. I had kids in college. I'm not proud of it. I respected the honesty. Why tell me now? I asked. Because she's getting sloppy, he replied. And because you were always different. I almost asked him what he meant, but I already knew. I saw how she treated you, he continued. I saw how she talked about you when you weren't there. You weren't part of the plan. That made you dangerous. I closed my eyes briefly. What do you have? I asked. Copies, he said. Emails, draft valuations. A ledger she kept off the main system. I shouldn't have them, but I do. I didn't react. Why not go to the authorities? He was quiet for a moment, because until recently, there was no injured party who could connect the dots. Now there is. After we hung up, I sat still for a long time. I wasn't angry. Anger is loud and unfocused. This was something else. This was the feeling you get when a shape finally comes into view after being in the dark too long. Everything I'd experienced wasn't random. It was structural, intentional. Exclusion wasn't the result. It was the mechanism. 2 days later, I met Samuel in person. A coffee shop off I-85, anonymous and loud enough to discourage eavesdropping. He slid a flash drive across the table without ceremony. "Everything's labeled," he said. "Dates, entities, context. I'm not speculating. I'm documenting." I didn't plug it in there. I thanked him and left. That night, I opened the files. They were worse than I expected. There were email chains where my mother explicitly discussed keeping me at arm's length from the business because I was too analytical. There were drafts of the trust amendment with margin notes about minimizing my visibility. There were spreadsheets showing asset transfers timed precisely around the amendment filing. And there was one email that made me stop breathing for a moment. From my mother to the estate attorney. Subject: Claire Holloway. She will not contest. She is conflict-averse and values family harmony over personal gain. Removing her simplifies succession and reduces risk. I wasn't a daughter in that sentence. I was a variable. I closed the laptop carefully, like it might explode if I didn't. The next step wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It was alignment. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer in Richmond who specialized in estate litigation and fiduciary breaches. I didn't give him everything at once. I gave him enough to ask the right questions. When I finished explaining, he leaned back in his chair. "You were removed because you would have noticed," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "And because," he continued, "if this comes apart, you're the only one in the family with both standing and credibility." I nodded. "Do you want to contest the trust?" he asked. I shook my head. No. That surprised him. "I want leverage," I said, "and I want the misrepresentation to stop." He smiled slowly. "That's more effective." Meanwhile, my mother grew restless. She called twice in 1 week, left voicemails that sounded casual but weren't. "Just checking in. Haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" I didn't return them. At work, I requested PTO for the following month. 2 weeks. My supervisor approved it without comment. I used one of those weeks to quietly visit the county offices where the original land deeds were filed. Old records, paper ones, the kind people assume no one checks anymore. I checked them. One parcel had been transferred under a power of attorney my grandfather had signed while hospitalized. The timing was questionable. By the end of that week, I had a clean timeline. Not emotional, not dramatic, just undeniable. The moment I knew things had tipped was when Evan called. Not texted. Called. "Mom says you're digging into things that don't concern you," he said, without preamble. "I am," I replied. "She's upset." "I know." There was a pause. "Why are you doing this?" I thought about that. Then I answered honestly, "Because I was removed to make something easier." "I want to know what." He sighed. "You always do this. You always make things complicated." "No," I said calmly. "I notice when they already are." He didn't respond. That night, I drafted a single letter. Not to my parents, not to Evan, to Whitmore and Keene. It was polite, professional, precise. I requested copies of all communications, drafts, and valuations related to the trust amendment that referenced my name or my removal. I cited my right to access under state law. I signed it. I didn't send it yet. There's power in holding a match before you strike it. I sent the letter on a Monday morning. Certified mail. Return receipt requested. No email, no warning, just paper, ink, and a timestamp that couldn't be argued away. By Wednesday afternoon, my mother called. This time, I answered. "Why are you doing this?" she asked without greeting. Her voice was tight, controlled, the way it gets when she realizes a conversation isn't going to go her way. "I asked for documents," I said. "That's all." "You know exactly what you're doing," she snapped. "You're trying to scare people." "I'm trying to understand decisions that affect me," I replied. "You said you value transparency." "That was a courtesy," she said, "not an invitation." I leaned back against my kitchen counter. "Then you shouldn't have removed me quietly. That invited questions." She exhaled sharply. "You're going to ruin this family." I let that sit. "Nothing I'm doing would matter," I said finally, "if everything was as clean as you say." Silence. Then, colder. "You've always been resentful." "No," I said. "I've always been observant. You just preferred it when I stayed quiet." She hung up. That was the first door. The second closed 2 days later, when Whitmore and Keene replied. The letter was courteous, to the point of insult. They acknowledged my request, but declined to provide drafts or internal communications, citing attorney-client privilege. They assured me all actions taken were legal, appropriate, and in the best interest of the trust. They also added a sentence at the end. Any further inquiries should be directed through counsel. I smiled when I read it. People only say that when they're nervous. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer. He responded within the hour. They're protecting themselves, he wrote, which means they know there's exposure. That same afternoon, Samuel emailed again. She's panicking, he wrote. She's been calling old contacts, asking who's talked to you. I didn't reply. That weekend, my father showed up at my apartment, unannounced, standing in the hallway with his hands in his coat pockets, looking older than he had at the wedding. I just want to talk, he said. I stepped aside and let him in. He sat at my kitchen table, glanced around at the clean lines, the framed certificates on the wall. He'd never visited before. She didn't mean to hurt you, he began. I know what she meant, I replied. I've read it. He flinched. Read what? I didn't answer directly. Did you know she moved assets under Grandpa's power of attorney? His face drained of color. What are you talking about? I watched him process it in real time. The way denial crumbles, not all at once, but in small fractures. She told me it was tax planning, he said weakly. I know, I replied. He put his head in his hands. She said you'd overreact. I sat across from him. Dad, listen to me carefully. I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I'm trying to stop something that's already unstable. He looked up. And if it falls? Then it falls, because it was built wrong. He nodded slowly. What do you need from me? The question surprised me. Nothing, I said. Yet, that night, I received an email from Evan. Subject, please stop. The body was short. Mom's not sleeping. You're tearing things apart. Whatever you're trying to prove, it's not worth it. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to understand why I had to be removed for things to work. He didn't respond. The following week, my lawyer filed a formal request with the county clerk for a review of the power of attorney transactions tied to my grandfather's hospitalization. It wasn't an accusation. It was a request for clarification. That distinction matters. The clerk flagged one transaction for review, just one. But it was enough. The first notice went out on a Thursday, a standard letter requesting additional documentation. My mother called that night. This time, she didn't yell. You have no idea what you're doing, she said quietly. I do, I replied, and so do you. She swallowed. I could hear it. If you keep going, there will be consequences. I thought about the trust, the business, the inheritance I'd already lost. I've already paid the price for staying quiet, I said. I'm not afraid of what happens next. She didn't threaten me again. She tried something else. On Friday, a rumor reached me through a cousin I barely spoke to. My mother had been telling people I was mentally unstable, that work stress had made me paranoid, that she was worried about me. I documented it. Dates, names, exact wording. Character assassination is a tactic. And like all tactics, it leaves tracks. By Sunday night, I had 3 separate accounts of the same story told with the same phrasing. That's when I realized this was no longer just about assets. It was about credibility. And whoever controlled that would control the ending. I opened my laptop and began drafting a timeline. Not for court. Not yet. For clarity. Every exclusion. Every omission. Every decision framed as concern. At the top of the document, I wrote a single sentence. This is not personal. This is pattern recognition. The next step wouldn't be loud. It would be definitive. The county clerk's request was supposed to be routine. That's what my lawyer said when he called me Monday morning. These things happen all the time, he told me. It doesn't mean anyone's accusing anyone yet. Yet. By noon, my mother had called him directly. That was how I knew the careful phase was over. She's insisting the transaction was properly authorized, he said, voice neutral but alert. She also asked whether you were planning to escalate. And what did you say? I asked. I said my client was seeking clarity, nothing more. I stared out my office window at the parking lot below. Cars coming and going. People moving through their days, unaware of how fragile their assumptions were. She doesn't believe in half measures, I said. If she's calling you, she's already assuming escalation. He paused. Then we should be prepared. That afternoon, I took a long walk instead of going straight home. I needed the physical movement, the reminder that I still occupied my own body, not just my thoughts. The air was cool, leaves scraped along the sidewalk like dry paper. I passed houses with lights on, families eating dinner, lives that appeared intact from the outside. I wondered how many of them were built on silence. When I got home, there was a package waiting at my door. No return address. Inside was a folder. Manila. Thick. I recognized Samuel's handwriting on a sticky note attached to the front. She's accelerating. You should see this now. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it. Inside were printed emails I hadn't seen before. Recent ones. My mother corresponding with a regional lender, discussing refinancing options. She described the business as temporarily encumbered and mentioned an upcoming internal restructuring that would resolve outstanding governance issues. Governance issues. That was me. There was also a draft agreement transferring partial ownership of one parcel to a newly formed LLC. The registered agent was a name I didn't recognize, but the mailing address was my parents' home. I took a slow breath. She wasn't just hiding past behavior. She was moving assets in real time, assuming I wouldn't act fast enough to matter. That night, I made a decision I'd been postponing. I called my lawyer and told him to proceed. Not with a lawsuit. Not with a public filing. With a formal notice of interest. Under state law, as a former named beneficiary removed under suspicious circumstances, I had standing to request a temporary injunction, preventing further transfers until documentation was reviewed. It was dry, technical, almost boring. It would also freeze her ability to move anything quietly. The notice was filed the next morning. At 10:42 a.m., my phone rang. It was Evan. "Are you trying to bankrupt Mom?" he demanded. "No," I said calmly. "I'm trying to stop unauthorized transfers." "She's crying," he said. "She says you're doing this out of spite." I leaned back in my chair. "Did she tell you about the refinancing emails?" Silence. "Did she tell you about the LLC she formed last month?" Still silence. "Evan," I said, "ask her why she needed to move assets again after the trust amendment. Ask her why she didn't want me seeing the books." "You always assume the worst," he snapped. "No," I replied. "I checked." He hung up. By the end of the day, my mother left me a voicemail. Not angry, not pleading, controlled. "You've crossed a line," she said. "If you don't withdraw this notice, I will make sure you regret it." I saved the message. Threats are useful when they're recorded. 2 days later, the injunction was granted. Temporary, limited, enough to require documentation before any further movement. That was the moment everything changed. The lender paused refinancing. The attorney's office stopped returning her calls as quickly. The illusion of control fractured. And then, the letter arrived. Handwritten. My mother's handwriting. Slanted, familiar, carefully emotional. I didn't open it right away. I made tea. I sat down. I waited until my hands were steady. She wrote about sacrifice, about how hard it was to hold a family together, about how my independence had always made her feel unnecessary. She wrote that she'd done what she thought was best, that she never imagined I would turn on her like this. There was no apology. At the end, she wrote one sentence that clarified everything. "If you continue, you will destroy what little inheritance there is left." I folded the letter and placed it in my file. The next morning, I received an email from Whitmore and Keene. They were withdrawing as counsel for the trust. No explanation, just notice. That afternoon, my lawyer called again, this time with something new in his voice. The clerk flagged a second transaction, he said, one that predates the amendment. It involves a property that was never disclosed in the trust inventory. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. That was how I knew I was past fear. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means there's an asset missing from the accounting," he replied. "And that changes the nature of everything." That night, I dreamed of my grandfather. He was standing in the old fields behind the farmhouse, hands in his pockets, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not disappointed, not proud, expectant. When I woke up, I understood something I'd been circling for weeks. This wasn't about revenge. This was about correction. My mother had built a system that relied on my silence, my predictability, my willingness to absorb discomfort so others wouldn't have to. She had mistaken restraint for weakness. The notice I filed wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. And for the first time, I stopped worrying about how this would look. I started focusing on how it would end. The request came through my lawyer first. Your mother would like to meet. In person, with counsel present. I read the message twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to note what wasn't there. No apology. No explanation. Just a meeting. On her terms, she assumed. I agreed, but with conditions. Neutral location, court reporter present, full disclosure of documents discussed. My lawyer handled the details. I didn't speak to her directly. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at a conference room in Richmond, the kind designed to feel impartial. Beige walls, long table, no windows, no sense of ownership. I arrived early, not to stake territory, but to settle myself. I laid out my folder in front of me, chronological, labeled, clean. I didn't need everything. I just needed enough. She arrived 10 minutes late. My mother looked composed, as always. Navy blazer, pearl earrings, hair perfectly set. She smiled when she saw me, the practiced version she used for donors and board members. Claire, she said, as if we were meeting for lunch. I nodded. Linda. That flicker of irritation told me she'd noticed the omission. Good. Her attorney, a man I'd never met, sat beside her. My lawyer sat to my left. The court reporter adjusted her equipment and began recording. Once the formalities were done, my mother spoke first. This has gotten out of hand, she said calmly. What started as a family misunderstanding has become unnecessarily adversarial. I said nothing. She continued. I'm willing to reinstate you as a limited beneficiary, 10%, non-voting, in exchange for withdrawing the injunction and agreeing to a confidentiality clause. There it was, the offer. Carefully measured, designed to sound generous. My lawyer glanced at me. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Before we discuss proposals, I said, I have questions. Her attorney shifted. This meeting isn't a deposition. I know, I replied, but it is recorded. My mother's smile tightened. Go on. Why was Parcel 14 never listed in the trust inventory? I asked. Silence. Her attorney cleared his throat. We're not prepared to. I am, I said, and slid a copy of the deed across the table. Transferred under power of attorney 3 weeks before my grandfather's stroke was disclosed to the family. My mother's eyes dropped to the paper for half a second. That was enough. That property was earmarked for development, she said. It wasn't relevant to the trust at the time. Then why was it used as collateral for a private loan 18 months later? I asked. Her attorney leaned forward. Miss Holloway, you're making assumptions. I'm asking questions, I replied. There's a difference. My mother exhaled slowly. You don't understand the pressures involved in managing a family business. I understand fiduciary duty, I said, and I understand omission. Her gaze hardened. What do you want? That was the real question. Not the offer, not the posture. That. I want full accounting, I said evenly. Independent audit, historical and current. And I want the trust amendment suspended until it's complete. Her attorney shook his head. That's not reasonable. It's necessary, I replied. If everything is as you've said, you'll be cleared. My mother laughed, sharp and sudden. You always did love hiding behind procedure. I met her eyes. Procedure is what keeps people from rewriting reality. She leaned back, studying me. For the first time, she looked uncertain, not afraid. Calculating. If I agree to an audit, she said slowly, will you stop contacting former employees? I didn't contact them, I replied. They contacted me. Her jaw tightened. The meeting stalled there. Lawyer spoke, language circled, nothing resolved. As we stood to leave, my mother reached for my arm. Not hard. Familiar. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. You could still be part of the family. I looked down at her hand, then back at her face. I am part of the family, I said. I'm just not part of your system anymore. I removed her hand and walked out. 2 days later, the audit was ordered by the court, not because of anything I'd said in that room, but because the second flag transaction had triggered a review requirement under state statute. Timing, procedure, things she'd always dismissed. The auditor assigned was a woman named Denise Calder. She'd spent 20 years unraveling exactly this kind of situation. She requested documents, access, interviews. My mother resisted at first, then complied, partially, then was compelled. Evan called me that night. "They're saying the business might be in trouble," he said. His voice was strained. "That lenders are nervous." "That happens when information changes," I replied. "You could stop this," he said. "Just say you're satisfied." "I'm not," I said. There was a long pause. "Mom says you're punishing her." I considered that. "I'm correcting the record." "She raised you," he said. "Yes." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and thought about how often love had been used as leverage. How easily concern turned into justification. How long I'd accepted the idea that keeping the peace was more important than keeping the truth intact. The audit took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of document requests, interviews, reconciliations. I was interviewed once, briefly. Denise asked me about my removal from the trust, my background, my access to information. She didn't ask how I felt. That told me everything about her. At the end of the 6th week, my lawyer called. "They found material misrepresentation," he said. "Multiple instances. Undisclosed assets, improper transfers." I closed my eyes. Not in relief. In recognition. "What happens now?" I asked. He paused. "Now the court has options." That night, for the first time since this began, there was no message. No accusation. No attempt to reframe. Just silence. And silence, when it comes this late, means someone else has run out of moves. The silence lasted 3 days. That was how I knew the report had landed. People like my mother don't go quiet unless something has shifted beyond their control. Silence wasn't strategy for her. It was damage assessment. On the 4th morning, my lawyer emailed me the preliminary findings. Not the full audit yet, but enough to change the posture of the case. Material misrepresentation of asset values. Failure to disclose multiple parcels held through affiliated LLCs. Improper use of power of attorney during a period of diminished capacity. Commingling of personal and business funds. The language was restrained, professional. It didn't need adjectives. Facts were enough. I printed the document and read it slowly, twice. Not because I doubted it, but because I needed to understand the weight of what had been confirmed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't aggressive planning. It was a pattern of manipulation that required my absence to function. By removing me, she hadn't simplified succession. She'd eliminated oversight. That afternoon, the calls started. Not from my parents, from extended family. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. A cousin who'd once told me I was too intense for family business. Their tone was careful, probing. "I heard things might be complicated," my aunt said. "That depends on what you heard," I replied. They wanted reassurance, that this would blow over, that the family name wouldn't be dragged through court filings, that holidays could resume their familiar rhythm. I didn't give them any of that. "I'm letting the process work," I said to each of them. That's all. At work, I kept my schedule unchanged. Meetings, reports, deadlines. The stability was grounding. No one there knew what was happening, and that anonymity mattered. My identity at work had never been conditional. That evening, Evan showed up at my apartment. He looked different, tired, less certain. The confidence he'd worn like armor at the wedding was gone. "I need to understand what's happening," he said, as soon as I let him in. I poured us both water and sat across from him at the table. "What part?" I asked. He ran a hand through his hair. "They're saying the trust might be invalid, that the business could be restructured, that Mom might be removed." I nodded. "She says you're enjoying this," he added quietly. I looked at him then. Really looked. "Do I seem like I'm enjoying it?" He didn't answer. "She also says you planned this, that you waited for the right moment." "That part's true," I said. His head snapped up. "So you admit it." "I plan to stop being quiet," I replied. I didn't plan for what was uncovered. He leaned back, frustration flashing across his face. "You could have come to me." "I did," I said. "Years ago. Every time I was dismissed. Every time I was told to adapt." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Evan, I continued. Did you ever ask why I was removed? He hesitated. Mom said it was practical. Did you ever ask practical for whom? He looked away. I don't want to lose everything, he said finally. That was the first honest thing he'd said all night. You won't, I replied. But you may lose the version of the story you were comfortable with. He stood to leave shortly after. At the door, he paused. If this goes to court, he said, it won't be the same. I nodded. It already isn't. 2 days later, the full audit was filed with the court. And then the story broke containment. A local business journal published a short piece. No names in the headline, but enough detail for anyone familiar with the Holloway name to connect the dots. Family-owned agribusiness faces governance review amid estate dispute. My mother called that night. Not to threaten, not to bargain, to plead. I never meant for this to go public, she said, voice thin. I know, I replied. Do you know what people are saying? She asked. Yes, they think I'm a criminal. I thought about the emails, the omissions, the pressure she'd applied to others to keep things quiet. They think you're accountable, I said. That's different. She started to cry. Real crying this time. No modulation, no control. I did this for you, she said. For Evan. For the family. I closed my eyes. You did this so you wouldn't lose control, I replied. And you taught us that love came with conditions. She went quiet. I won't fight you anymore, she said finally. Just tell me what you want. I considered that question carefully. I want you to stop, I said. Stop moving assets. Stop rewriting history. Stop using me as a variable. And then, she asked, and then the process will end where it ends. She hung up without saying goodbye. The next morning, my lawyer called. The court has ordered a restructuring, he said. Temporary removal of your mother as managing member. Independent trustee appointed. The trust amendment is suspended, pending review. I let that settle. What about me? I asked. You'll be reinstated as a contingent beneficiary until final determination, he said. But more importantly, you'll have access. Access. That was the word that mattered. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and thought about how close I'd come to disappearing quietly from something that shaped my entire upbringing. How easy it would have been to accept the story I'd been given and move on. But acceptance, I realized, isn't peace when it's built on erasure. The narrative had broken. And once it breaks, it doesn't go back together the same way. The first document that arrived after the court order wasn't dramatic. It was a spreadsheet, rows of assets, columns of valuations, dates, notes. The kind of file I'd spent my career reviewing without emotional attachment. Except this time, every line carried a memory. Land my grandfather used to walk at dusk. Accounts opened the year Evan went to college. Parcels purchased quietly, while my mother insisted there was nothing left for me to inherit. Access changes perspective. With the independent trustee in place, communications shifted. No more indirect messages through my father. No more carefully worded emails from attorneys designed to discourage curiosity. Everything went through a single channel. Documented. Traceable. Clean. I spent evenings reviewing materials not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand the full scope. Not to punish, to close the loop. One night, buried in an old set of financials, I found something small but telling. A handwritten note scanned into the system. My grandfather's handwriting. It referenced a future plan to split ownership evenly, provided both children remain engaged in good faith. Good faith. I stared at that phrase for a long time. It hadn't been me who stepped away. The next call came from Denise Calder, the auditor. I wanted you to hear this directly, she said. Your cooperation made this possible. I just answered questions, I replied. Most people don't, she said. They defend. You clarified. She paused. There's one more issue. It's not illegal, but it's relevant. I listened. Several decisions that excluded you were justified internally as being for your own benefit, she said. Your mother positioned you as unwilling, uninterested, or unstable. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. I know. The problem, she continued, is that narrative was used to support decisions that required your absence. That's significant in determining intent. Intent. After the call, I sat with that word. Intent is what turns harm into accountability. A week later, my father asked to meet. We chose a park halfway between our cities, neutral ground again. He looked thinner. His hand shook slightly when he lifted his coffee. I didn't know, he said. Not the extent of it. I believe you, I replied. And I did. She made it sound like you'd chosen distance, he continued. That you didn't want to be involved. I was never invited, I said gently. He nodded, eyes wet. I should have asked more questions. Yes, I agreed. Not cruelly, just honestly. We walked for a while, leaves crunching underfoot. He told me he was stepping back from the business entirely, that the court had suggested it, that he was tired. I don't want to choose sides, he said. I'm not asking you to, I replied. I'm choosing myself. He stopped walking and looked at me then. You always have. That wasn't true, but it was kind. As weeks passed, the fallout spread. Lenders renegotiated terms. The business stabilized under interim management. No collapse, no scandal, just correction. Evan stopped calling. At first, that hurt. Then it clarified. I realized how much of our relationship had been mediated through our mother. Without her directing the flow, there wasn't much left. One afternoon, I received an email from him. No subject line. I didn't know how much of this was built on keeping you out. I don't know what to do with that. I read it twice. Then I replied, you don't have to do anything with it right now. Just don't deny it. That was all. The court set a final hearing date for late spring. Not a trial, a resolution conference. The aim wasn't punishment, it was closure. In preparation, my lawyer asked me a question I hadn't considered. If the trust is reinstated evenly, he said, do you want your share? I didn't answer right away. I thought about the apartment I'd built my life in, the work that sustained me, the sense of self that hadn't depended on any of this. I thought about how money complicates motives. I want what's fair, I said finally, but I don't want control. He nodded. That's rare. I've seen what control costs, I replied. The week before the hearing, my mother sent one last message. Not through lawyers, not through family. A single sentence. I hope you're happy now. I didn't respond. Happiness had never been the goal. Clarity had. The night before the hearing, I slept deeply for the first time in months. No rehearsing conversations, no anticipating reactions. Just rest. When I woke, I knew something with certainty. Whatever happened next, I would not return to the version of myself that made this possible. Some doors, once closed, stay that way. And some, once opened, don't need to be walked through again. The resolution conference took place on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse that smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. No spectators, no raised voices. Just a long table, neutral walls, and people who understood that most damage is done quietly. I arrived early, again. Not out of habit this time, but because I wanted to sit with the moment before it happened. For years, my family had made decisions about me without me. This was the first time the outcome would include my consent. My mother arrived last. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically fragile, but reduced. The confidence that used to fill rooms had thinned, stretched too far by weeks of scrutiny and loss of control. Her attorney whispered to her as they sat. She nodded, eyes fixed on the table. Evan was there too. He didn't look at me at first. When he finally did, there was something like apology in his eyes, but not enough courage to carry it forward. The mediator began with a summary. Calm, procedural, no judgment, just sequence. Findings, options. The trust amendment, he explained, could be voided entirely due to material misrepresentation. The court was prepared to reinstate the original terms. That would mean equal division, equal control. Alternatively, a settlement could be reached, one that restructured ownership, reduced future conflict, and avoided further litigation. Then he turned to me. Ms. Holloway, he said, what outcome are you seeking? Every face at the table shifted slightly. This was the moment my mother had never planned for. The variable speaking. I didn't rush my answer. I'm not seeking control of the business, I said. And I'm not seeking retribution. My mother looked up sharply. I'm seeking separation, I continued. Clear boundaries. No more leverage disguised as love. The mediator nodded. Can you be more specific? Yes, I said. I want my share converted to a financial interest only. No management role, no voting power. paid out over time, or placed in trust under independent oversight. I want no future entanglement. Evan frowned. You just walk away? I've already walked away, I replied. This just formalizes it. My mother's attorney leaned forward. And what of Mrs. Holloway's role? I turned to look at my mother then. Really looked. For a moment, I saw the woman she might have been if fear hadn't run her life. I want her removed from any fiduciary position, I said calmly. Permanently. The word landed hard. My mother's breath caught. You can't, she said. This is my family. This is a business, I replied, and a trust, and you violated both. The mediator raised a hand gently. Mrs. Holloway, would you like to respond? She did something I hadn't expected. She shook her head. No speech, no justification, no appeal to history. Just a small, tired motion. Yes, she said quietly. I agree. The room went still. Evan turned toward her. Mom? She didn't look at him. I'm tired, she said, and I don't want to fight her anymore. Her attorney started to object, then stopped. The calculation was obvious. This was the least damaging option left. The mediator took notes. Adjustments were discussed. Numbers refined. Timelines set. It was efficient. Almost merciful. When it was done, the papers were signed. Not dramatically. No shaking hands. Just ink on clean lines. As we stood to leave, Evan stepped toward me. I didn't think it would end like this, he said. Neither did I replied. But it needed to. He nodded once. I don't know what we are now. I thought about that. We're honest, I said. That's new. He almost smiled. My mother waited until the room was nearly empty before speaking to me. I thought if I controlled everything, nothing could hurt us, she said. Her voice was flat, not defensive. I didn't realize I was the one doing the damage. I held her gaze. Control feels like safety when you don't trust anyone else. She nodded slowly. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. I know, I replied. We stood there for a moment longer. Two people who shared blood, but no longer shared a system. Then I walked out. Outside, the air was bright. Early spring. The kind of day that feels like a beginning, even when it isn't. I sat in my car and didn't turn the engine on right away. My hands rested loosely on the steering wheel. Steady. Calm. I felt no triumph, no relief. Just a quiet certainty. The story my family had told about me no longer applied. And the one I was living didn't require their approval. The strange thing about endings like that is how quiet they are afterward. No explosion, no victory lap. Just a slow return to ordinary days that feel unfamiliar because the tension you lived with for so long is suddenly gone. For weeks after the resolution conference, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. A call, a reversal, some emotional ambush disguised as reconciliation. It didn't come. The paperwork finalized without drama. My portion of the trust was converted exactly as agreed, placed under independent management, scheduled for structured payouts over time. No decisions required from me, no meetings, no votes, clean lines. That was intentional. I didn't want leverage over them any more than I wanted it over me. At work, nothing changed, which was its own kind of gift. My identity there hadn't been built on family narratives or obligations. I was still Claire, who fixed broken systems and asked uncomfortable questions without raising her voice. If anything, I was sharper, lighter. Meetings felt shorter, decisions clearer. It turned out that carrying less emotional weight left more room for thinking. My father called once a week at first, then less often. Not because we were drifting, but because the conversations no longer revolved around crisis management. Sometimes we talked about books, sometimes about the weather. Once, he told me he'd started volunteering at a local food bank. I like doing something where the rules are simple, he said. I understood that more than he knew. Evan and I existed in a careful truce. We texted on birthdays, exchanged updates about practical things. There was no pretending we'd suddenly become close, but there was no hostility either. That, too, was a kind of progress. One afternoon, a few months after everything settled, I received an email from the independent trustee. Routine update. Portfolio performance. No action required. I almost deleted it without reading. then stopped. There was a note at the bottom. Your grandfather's original letters of intent have been fully archived. If you'd like copies for personal records, let me know. I hesitated, then replied yes. The packet arrived a week later. Inside were handwritten notes I'd never seen. Observations about the business, about Evan, about me. One line stood out. Claire asks the right questions. She doesn't rush answers. That will matter someday, even if it's inconvenient now. I sat with that sentence longer than I expected. For so many years, I'd internalized the idea that being difficult meant being wrong. That keeping the peace was the same as being good. That love was something you earned by not needing too much. I hadn't realized how deeply that had shaped my decisions until it stopped shaping them at all. The real karma wasn't my mother losing control of the business. It wasn't the court order or the audit or the public correction of her narrative. Karma wasn't loud enough for that. Karma was watching her adjust to a world where people asked her questions she couldn't redirect, where decisions were documented, where charm didn't override process. It was subtle, bureaucratic, relentless. She moved into a smaller house near Charlottesville, sold the one she'd insisted on keeping for appearances. She joined a charity board, then resigned after 6 months. Structure didn't bend for her the way it used to. We spoke once, briefly, at a family funeral. Polite, distant, no attempts at intimacy. She didn't ask about my life. I didn't offer. That was the boundary holding. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment, I realized something else had shifted. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I no longer scanned messages for hidden meanings. I no longer braced myself when my phone rang with a family number. The vigilance was gone. In its place was something quieter. Agency. I started saying no faster. Not harshly. Cleanly. I stopped explaining decisions that didn't require consensus. I noticed how often women my age were trained to soften their certainty, to preemptively accommodate discomfort that wasn't theirs to manage. I stopped doing that. A colleague once asked how I stayed so calm during tense negotiations. I thought about it, then answered honestly. I don't confuse intensity with importance, I said. And I don't give people more access than they've earned. She nodded like she'd been handed something useful. That winter, I spent Thanksgiving alone, by choice. I cooked for myself, watched the parade, took a long walk in the cold. It wasn't lonely. It was spacious. On Christmas morning, my father sent a photo of a small tree in his apartment. No ornaments, just lights. Peaceful, he wrote. Yes, I replied. It is. I didn't rebuild my life because it hadn't been destroyed. That was the part people misunderstand about stories like this. I wasn't broken and then fixed. I was constrained, then released. The confrontation wasn't the climax. The clarity was. And clarity doesn't shout. It settles in and stays. The last check arrived in early spring. Not large enough to change my life. Not symbolic enough to feel like a trophy. Just a transfer, right on schedule, from an account I didn't manage and no longer needed to monitor. I logged in, confirmed the deposit, and closed the tab. That was it. No rush of emotion. No sense of victory. Just finality. I used part of that money to do something my mother would have called impractical. I took 3 weeks off work and traveled alone. Not anywhere flashy. Coastal Maine first, then a quiet town in New Mexico, where the nights were wide and silent. I stayed in small places, walked a lot, thought less. On the third night in Maine, sitting on a cold bench overlooking the water, it hit me that this was the first time in my adult life that no one could use my absence or presence as leverage. I wasn't being missed in a strategic way. I wasn't being excluded to make a point. I simply was where I chose to be. That realization felt bigger than the inheritance ever could. When I came back, life didn't suddenly become perfect. Work was still work. Some days were heavy. Some nights were restless. Healing isn't linear, and it's not dramatic. It's mostly made of small, boring choices repeated consistently. But something fundamental had changed. I no longer negotiated my worth. At a family gathering that summer, a distant cousin pulled me aside. I heard everything, she said in a hushed voice, like it was still dangerous to say out loud. I don't know how you did it. I would have just let it go. I smiled, not unkindly. I did let it go, I said, after I took it back. That's the part people miss. Setting boundaries isn't about punishment. It's about retrieval. Taking back the right to decide who gets access to you, your time, your labor, your silence. I didn't expose my family to humiliate them. I didn't push forward to prove I was right. I acted because staying quiet had become a form of self-betrayal. For years, I thought love meant enduring discomfort, that being the reasonable one meant absorbing harm so others could stay comfortable, that if I just stayed calm enough, capable enough, agreeable enough, I would earn security. What I learned instead is this. Love that requires you to disappear isn't love. It's control with good manners. The real revenge wasn't the audit, or the court order, or my mother losing her position. It was choosing not to carry what was never mine to begin with. It was stepping out of a system designed to benefit from my compliance and refusing to replace it with another one. I didn't win by taking something from them. I won by choosing myself without apology. Today, my life is quieter. Smaller in some ways, stronger in others. I still speak to my father. I still care about my brother, from a distance that feels honest. I no longer explain my choices to people who mistake access for entitlement, and I sleep better than I ever have. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I want you to hear one thing clearly. You are not difficult for noticing patterns. You are not ungrateful for wanting transparency. You are not selfish for choosing peace over performance. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to confront loudly, but to stop participating quietly. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt excluded, manipulated, or rewritten out of your own family narrative, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you want more stories about boundaries, betrayal, karma, and the slow, steady reclaiming of dignity, like and subscribe. Some endings aren't about closure. They're about freedom. And that one, you get to choose.